Our next speaker is our very special guest who's come a very long way to be here. Laurent Scott de Martinville, the great-grandson of Edouard-Léon Scott de Martinville, received a scientific education at the École Polytechnique in Paris and graduated as a civil engineer. A student of China and Chinese culture, he represented several major French companies in Northeast Asia. Recently retired, Laurent is now happy to spend more time on family matters, such as this.
So, Edouard-Léon was my great-grandfather. He passed away long before I was born, as did his son, my grandfather. However, in my childhood, I did see a phonautograph, a strange machine made of wood and metal, made up of a long barrel-shaped funnel closed by a membrane on which a stylus was fixed. It was explained to me that when someone spoke in front of this machine, the flexible membrane caused the stylus to move, inscribing graphic variations on a sheet of paper covered in lamp black. I was also told that the forefather who had created this machine was an unlucky figure, as the scientific value of his invention had not been recognized, and this had caused him deep bitterness. Well, despite my limited knowledge of the subject, I had always been eager to find an opportunity to restore his memory. I could never have imagined the circumstances that would bring me to investigate this strange great-grandfather. In early 2008, I was contacted by the BBC as one of Edouard-Léon Scott's descendants. And I learned that a team of American researchers, the First Sounds Initiative, was working on the first recording of the human voice. They maintained that the fragile oscillations on lamp black that my great-grandfather had obtained were complete recordings, as Edouard-Léon Scott had always contended. What's more, to my great surprise, they had proof. Indeed, their hard work had come to fruition. They had just set up a method that could play phonautograms. The oscillations of the first of these recordings revealed a voice, and that voice sang "Au clair de la lune." For this event, which was to take place on March 28, 2008, the BBC invited me to their Paris studio to take part in a program where this extraordinary recording was played, the first recording of the human voice. The day before, the story had been a front-page headline in the New York Times. Well, in the years that followed, an exceptional bond formed between this team of American researchers and my family. We were awed and inspired by the passion that the team put in their quest and their constant drive to let the world know about this discovery, despite the innumerable obstacles they faced along the way. So I would like to commend and thank them, as well as those who recognize the significance of their work, our gracious and welcoming hosts for today's event. Now, as his descendant, I'll tell you a little about Edouard-Léon Scott's family, a family in which history sometimes seems to repeat itself. Indeed, Edouard-Léon, whom we honor today, was himself the grandson of another inventor, Auguste Toussaint, Scott de Martinville, who created a dirigible airship in Paris. This was in 1789, at the beginning of the French Revolution, not the ideal moment for an invention. It was largely ignored, then forgotten, despite the support of influential figures such as the writer Beaumarchais. His grandson, Edouard-Léon, is our subject today. Born in Paris on April 25, 1817, he was the only child of an erudite father, as passionate about grammar, art, and literature as he was about science, and an expert in bibliophily. But he was also deeply authoritarian and even tyrannical. He had lost his own father at a very young age, and his mother had sent him to be an apprentice in a printing press, specializing in science and mathematics. Here, he stood out for his work ethic, brilliant mind, and impressive abilities. Edouard-Léon followed his father's footsteps, and one might have thought that their shared interests and talents would have been a source of closeness. But that was far from the case. They did not get along. It may have been their very different personalities that set them apart, or possibly it was their shared traits, curiosity about all subjects and extreme creativity, that turned them into rivals. In any event, Edouard-Léon was brought up by three women whose influence tempered his father's fierce authority: his mother, grandmother, and great-aunt. Despite his rebellion against his father, he was taken on at the Maison Bachelier, a printing and publishing house where his father held a key position. The Maison Bachelier was famous for having the most beautiful typographic fonts of numbers and symbols used for the writing of mathematical formulas. The young Edouard-Léon began to acquire the knowledge of typography that would make him an expert. Of course, he knew all the families of letters sorted into the printing press's type cases, but he also learned to recognize ancient typographic fonts, those created by the Didos over several generations and those used by other printers, wherever books were printed since the earliest days of the printing press. By simply looking at the curve of an S, he could tell whether this letter was a Didon or a Bodoni, the great Italian family of typographers. He was quickly recognized for his keen sense of observation. As a proofreader, he read not only the scientific texts to be published, but also those that the Maison Bachelier would receive for evaluation or assessment, as well as many others outside his work. Nevertheless, money was in short supply, and this was a recurring problem. Perhaps this was why Edouard-Léon entrusted his father with the care of his daughter until her adolescence, in spite of the difficult father-son dynamic. In the 1840s, he attended meetings at the offices of the newspaper L'Atelier, and he subsequently became one of his journalists and editors. This movement called for reform and hoped to found a guild of typographers made up exclusively of associates, which would enable workers to share in the profits. His father was infuriated by these political leanings. However, Edouard-Léon was soon disillusioned by the dirty political trickery he observed, and he would later become a moderate Republican. In the meantime, having left the Maison Bachelier, he became a proofreader at the Moniteur Universel. He also opened a shop in the Rue des Petits Augustins, where he and his wife sold prints, engravings, and antiquarian books. But this didn't generate much income, and he therefore took on an additional job as proofreader at the Journal des Débats. Despite this, business went from bad to worse, and eventually Edouard-Léon's marriage fell apart under the strain. Surprisingly, Edouard-Léon was preoccupied by totally different matters. He became increasingly interested in the topic of physiology, and particularly the physiology of the ear. He began to focus on one idea, an artificial ear that would transcribe onto sensitive paper the sounds and noise produced in the ambient air. Had no one ever thought of this before? The idea grabbed him and became an obsession. And thus he began to lay the foundation of this quest to write sounds. To begin with, he fiddled around doing a number of trial runs followed by expensive experiments. Finally, after a seemingly interminable phase of trial and error, in early 1857, he developed a real machine, which he dubbed the phonautograph, a first prototype made of wood and metal. It was an attractive instrument, if rudimentary. He was convinced that his invention would pave the way for the writing of sound. But could he have imagined that in the distant future, these graphic markings would actually be transformed into sound? I still wonder. What is certain is that this was one of the highlights of his life, and on January 26, 1857, he entrusted a sealed envelope containing the details of his invention to the Academy of Science. On March 25th of the same year, he decided to protect his discovery by taking out a patent, of which the first annuity fees were financed by the Société d'encouragement pour l'industrie nationale. During this period, he wrote enthusiastically that he felt his scientific career was truly launched, and I imagine him as finally being happy. However, his enthusiasm was not to last. In parallel to his scientific research, he continued to pursue his passion for antiquarian books, paintings, and engravings, which he began to purchase in large numbers, despite his constant worries about money. I must admit that it's not always easy to understand the life of this passionate man with such wide-ranging interests, but clearly lacking business sense. In 1859, Edouard-Léon took on a position at Ambroise Firmin Didot's. The Maison Didot was far more than a printing house. During the Revolution, it was the Maison Didot that printed the assignats, the official banknotes. The Didot family were publishers, as well as collectors of incunables and rare books. They reprinted classic texts with dazzling illustrations and magnificent bindings. And for half a century, they had been one of the official printers for the Institute of France. There could have been no better place for Edouard-Léon to become a full expert in bibliophily. His success was so quick and impressive that after 2 years he became personal secretary to Ambroise Firmin Didot, whom he greatly admired. Didot entrusted him with certain difficult tasks and appraisals, followed by the drafting of notices, texts, and finally full books, although these were almost never attributed to him. One of his tasks was the preparation of the 5th edition of the very famous Manuel du Libraire, catalogue for librarians and booksellers, which was both a dictionary and a catalogue of bibliographic references. In the meantime, he continued his work on the recording of sound, teaming up with Koenig, a talented manufacturer of scientific instruments, for the construction of a new phonautograph, which was to be more robust and efficient than the first. On July 15, 1861, he secured an audience with the Academy of Science. At this point, he surely still believed his machine has a bright future. In 1864, however, in his Traité élémentaire de physique, elementary treatise on physics, Ganot, a professor of physics and mathematics, presented the machine Koenig had built. But in December of the same year, faced with the extreme difficulties of trying to decipher the phonautograms and an ever-increasing workload for Didot, Edouard-Léon Scott failed to renew the protection of his invention, and the phonautograph's patent fell within the public domain. So with regards to the discovery that brought us together today, the story ends there. But my great-grandfather's life did not end there. Like his father, who had worked and written a great deal on French grammar, he wrote a manuel de l'orthographe, manual of orthography, and an histoire de la réforme orthographique depuis le XVe siècle, a history of orthographic reform since the 15th century, works that were not to bear his name, but that of Didot. He continued to write for Didot and traveled around Europe to appraise the top book collections put up for sale. He bought the rarest books for the Maison Didot, purchasing only a few lower quality books for himself in line with his budget. At one point, he was sent to Lyon to appraise the greatest European collection of chivalric romances, which was to be put up for sale. For Didot, he purchased a number of these, including the finest specimens. He wrote annotations and descriptions of each of them, and the Maison Didot published this epic work under the title Classification of Chivalric Romances. But in 1870, the German army besieged Paris. Along with a friend, Edouard-Léon Scott founded the Patriotic Assistance Committee for the 6th arrondissement, which distributed donations of food and clothing for 3 months, despite the ceaseless shelling. This earned him the neighborhood nickname of Père 30 sous, after the 30 sous, 30 sous means 30 sous, the 30 sous coin, which was the daily pay of the neediest National Guardsmen who were emergency recruits. It was at this most inopportune moment that Diderot chose to inform him that he could no longer afford his services. Callously, he declared that my great-grandfather's assistant would do the job well enough. It was a deeply wounding blow, made all the worse by the fact that Diderot owed him a great deal of money. It would be a very long time before he was fully reimbursed. One must admit there was cause for acrimony. Edouard-Léon fell ill and traveled south for some time to recover in warmer climate. It was at this point that he received a request for the appraisal of the recently deceived Marquis de Morant's spectacular library. He left to do this work and was joined shortly thereafter by Miss Volz, whose sister had kept his house during the siege of Paris, and who would become his second wife and my great-grandmother, sorry. But Diderot was behind the intermediary who had sent this request. Once again, Diderot needed his help to get his hands on the exceptional books he wanted to complete his collection. There followed a chain of unfortunate circumstances, scams of which Edouard-Léon Scott was the victim, and a succession of abortive attempts to break even without the slightest bit of help. And when he returned to Paris, he found that almost nothing remained of the collection of paintings, antiquarian books, and engravings that he had entrusted to his daughter and son-in-law before leaving for Spain. Hardworking as ever, he nevertheless continued to publish works such as Destruction of the Value of Personal Property in France by the Monopoly of Auction House, and drafted articles on social and industrial issues which would remain unpublished. Finally, he moved into a home overlooking a courtyard in the Rue Vivienne with his second wife and children. It was here in 1878 that he learned of Edison's discovery, and saw that his name was not even cited. He died less than a year later of a ruptured aneurysm at the age of 62, leaving behind his wife, then pregnant, with their fourth child. His life's terribly sad end makes my joy today at today's event all the greater. Seeing Edward-Léon Scott's invention taking its rightful place alongside Thomas Edison's is a recognition that would have brought him profound satisfaction. Today's handshake associates two great aspirations. What a beautiful achievement.